They reached San Carlos again, and Humboldt passed a part of the night in the open air, waiting vainly for the stars. The air was misty, notwithstanding the white waters, which were to lead them beneath an ever-starry sky. They passed 3 nights at San Carlos, Humboldt watching during the greater part of them, in the hope of seizing the moment of the passage of some star over the meridian, that he might have nothing to reproach himself with. He kept his instruments always ready for an observation. On the banks of the Cassiquare, he purchased from the Indians 2 fine large birds, a toucan and a species of macaw, 17 inches long, having the whole body of a purple color. He had already in his canoe 7 parrots, 2 manakins, a motmot, 2 guans, 2 manavarins, and 8 monkeys. Father Zia whispered some complaints at the daily augmentation of their ambulatory collection. The toucan resembles the raven in manners and intelligence. It is a courageous bird, but easily tamed. Its long and stout beak served to defend it at a distance. It can make itself master of the house, steals whatever it can come at, and loves to bathe often and fish on the banks of the river. The toucan that Humboldt brought was very young, yet it took delight in, during the whole voyage, in teasing the nocturnal monkeys, which were melancholy and irritable. Most of the animals were confined in small wicker cages. Others ran at full liberty in all parts of the boat. At the approach of rain, the macaws sent forth noisy cries. The toucan wanted to reach the shore to fish, and the little monkeys went in search of Father Zia to take shelter in the large sleeves of his Franciscan habit. These incidents sometimes amused the travelers, so much that they forgot the torment of the mosquitoes. At night, they placed a leather case containing their provisions in the center, then their instruments and the cages of their animals. Their hammocks were suspended around the cages, and beyond were those of the Indians. The exterior circle was formed by the fires which were lighted to keep off the jaguars. Such was the order of their encampment on the banks of the Cassiquare. Among the Indians in their canoe was a fugitive from Guayasaya, who had become sufficiently civilized in a few weeks to be useful to them in placing the instruments necessary for their observations at night. He was no less mild than intelligent, and they had some desire of taking him into their service, which was their horror when, in talking to him by means of an interpreter, they learned the flesh of the Mariamode monkeys, though blacker, appeared to him to have the taste of human flesh. He told them that his relations preferred the inside of the hands in man as in bears. This assertion was accompanied with gestures of savage gratification. They inquired of this young man, so calm and so affectionate in the little service which he had rendered them, whether he still felt sometimes a desire to eat of a chedilcharahena. He answered without discomposure that, living in the mission, he would only eat that he was eaten by the padres. As they approached the bifurcation of the Orinoco, their passage became troublesome on account of the luxuriance of the vegetation. There was no longer a bank. A palisade of tufted trees formed the margin of the river. They saw a canal 1,200 feet broad, bordered by 2 enormous walls clothed with lianas and foliage. They often tried to land but without success. Towards the sunset, they sailed along for an hour, seeking to discover not an opening, since none existed, but a spotless wooded where their Indians, by means of the hatchet and manual labor, could clear enough space for a resting place for 12 or 13 persons. It was impossible to pass the night in their canoe. The mosquitoes which tormented them during the day accumulated towards evening beneath the roof covered with palm leaves, which served to shelter them from rain. Their hands and faces had never before been so much swelled. Father Zia, who had till then boasted of living in his missions of the cataracts, the largest and fiercest mosquitoes, at length gradually acknowledged that the sting of the insects of the casaquare was the most painful he had ever felt. They experienced great difficulty amid a thick forest in finding wood to make a fire, the branches of the trees being so full of sap that they would scarcely burn. There being no bare shore, it was hardly possible to procure old wood, which the Indians called wood baked in the sun. However, fire was necessary to them only as a defense against the beasts of the forest, for they had such a scarcity of provision that they had little need of fuel for the purpose of preparing their food. On the 18th of May, towards evening, they discovered a spot where wild cocoa trees were growing on the bank of the river. It rained violently, but the apotheosis aruns and lilianas furnished so thick a natural trellis that they were sheltered as under a vault of foliage. The Indians, whose hammocks were placed on the edge of the river, interwove the heliconias so as to form a kind of roof over them. Their fires lighted up so as to the height of 50 or 60 feet. To the palm trees, the Ilianas, loaded with flowers, and the columns of white smoke which were ascended in a straight line towards the sky. They passed the nights of the 20th, the last of the passage of the Casaquare, near the point of the bifurcation of the Orinoco. They had some hopes of being able to make an astronomical observation, as falling stars of remarkable magnitude were visible through the vapors that veiled the sky, whence they concluded that the stratum of vapors must be very thin, since meteors of this kind were scarcely ever seen below a cloud. Those they now beheld shot through the north and succeeded each other at almost equal intervals. The Indians, who seldom ennobled by their expressions the wandering of the imagination, named the falling stars the urine, and the dew and the spittle of the stars. The clouds thickened anew, and the travelers discerned neither the meteors nor the real stars, for which they had waited during several days. They had been told that they would not that they should find the insects at Esmeralda still more cruel and voracious than in the branch of the Orinoco, which they were going up. Nevertheless, they indulged the hope of at length sleeping in a spot that was inhabited, and of taking some exercise in herbalizing. The anticipation was, however, disturbed at their last resting place on the Casaquare. Whilst they were sleeping on the edge of the forest, they were warned by the Indians in the middle of the night that they heard very near the cries of a jaguar. These cries, they alleged, came from the top of the neighboring trees. As their fires burnt brightly, the travelers paid little attention to the cries of the jaguars, who had been attracted by the smell and noise of their dog. This animal began at first to bark, and when the jaguars drew nearer, to howl, hiding himself below the hammocks of the travelers. Great was their grief when, in the morning, at the moment of re-embarking, the Indians informed them that the dog had disappeared. There could be no doubt that when he had been carried off by the jaguars. Perhaps when their cries had ceased, he had wandered from the fires on the side of the beach. They waited part of their morning in the hope that the dog had only strayed. 3 days after they came back to the same place, they heard again the cries of the jaguars, but all their search was in vain. The dog, which had accompanied them from Caracas, had so often in swimming escaped the pursuit of crocodiles, had been devoured in the forest. On the 21st, they again entered the bed of the Orinoco, 3 leagues below the mission of Esmeralda. It was now a month since they had left the river near the mouth of the Guayvara. They had still to proceed 750 leagues before reaching Agnostra. At Esmeralda, they were cordially received by an old officer who took them for Catalonian shopkeepers, and who supposed that trade had led them to missions. On seeking packages of paper intended for drying their plants, he smiled at their simple ignorance. "You come," said he, "to a country where this kind of merchandise has no sale. We write little here, and the dried leaves of maize, the plantain tree, and the heliconia serve us like paper in Europe, to wrap up needles, fish hooks, and other little articles, of which we are careful." This old officer united in this person the civil and ecclesiastical authority. He taught the children the rosary, he rang the bells to amuse himself, and impelled by ardent zeal for the service of the church, he sometimes used his cloister's wand in a manner not very agreeable to the natives. When they arrived at Esmeralda, the greater part of the Indians were returning from an excursion which they had made to the east beyond the Rio Padmado to gather Brazil nuts. Their return was celebrated by a festival which was called in the mission the Festival of Brazil Nuts, which resembled the harvest homes and vintage feasts of Germany. The woman had prepared a quantity of fermented liquor, and during the 2 days the Indians were in a state of intoxication. The harvest was celebrated by dancing and drinking. The hut where the natives were assembled displayed during several days a singular aspect. There was neither table nor bench, but large roasted monkeys, blackened by smoke, were ranged in regular order against the wall. The manner of roasting the animals contributed to render their appearance extremely disagreeable in the eyes of the travelers. A little grating or lattice of very hard wood was formed and raised 1 foot from the ground. The monkey was skinned and bent into a sitting posture, the head generally resting on the arms, which were menagerie and long. When it was tied on the grating, a very clear smoke was kindled below. The monkey, enveloped in smoke and flame, was broiled and blackened at the same time. On seeing the natives devour the arm or leg of a roasted monkey, it was difficult not to believe that this habit of eating animals, so closely resembling man in their physical organization, had to a certain degree contributed to diminish the horror of cannibalism among these people. The flesh of monkeys is so lean and dry that Bonpland had preserved in his collections at Paris an arm and hand which had been broiled over this fire at Esmeralda, and no smell rose from them after the lapse of many years. The travelers saw the Indians dance. The monotony of their dancing was increased by the women not daring to take part in it. The men, young and old, formed a circle, holding each other's hands, and turned sometimes to the right, sometimes to the left, for whole hours with great silent gravity. Most frequently, the dancers themselves were the musicians. Feeble sounds drawn from a series of reeds and of different lengths formed a slow and plaintive accompaniment. The first dancer, to mark the time, bent both knees in a kind of cadence. Sometimes they all made a pause in their places and executed little oscillatory movements, bending the body from one side to the other. Where they were weary of dancing, the women brought them roasted monkey and palm cabbage, not forgetting their native liquors, which were strong and heady. Leaving Esmeralda on the afternoon of the 23rd, the travelers reached the bifurcation of the Orinoco, which they remained that night. Descending the river the next morning, they passed the mouths of the Rio Guanacunumo and the Guanami and Piraneme. Between the sources of the Rio Blanco and the Rio Equilio, they met with rocks and symbolical figures. They were also shown near the Colimaraki on the banks of the Casaquare. Traces were believed to be regular characters. They were, however, only misshapen figures representing the heavenly bodies, together with tigers, crocodiles, and boas and instruments used for making the flour of cassava. It was impossible to recognize in these painted rocks any symmetrical arrangement or characters with regular spaces. The travelers stopped at the village of Santa Barbara on the evening of the 25th. During the whole of the next day, they enjoyed the view of the 5 mountains of Sipapo, which rose at a distance more than 18 leagues in the direction of the north-northwest. The vegetation on the banks of the Orinoco was singularly varied in this part of the country. The arborescent ferns descended from the mountains and mingled with the palm trees of the plain. They rested that night on the islands of Minisi, and after having passed the mouths of the little rivers Quajama, Abua, and Mahasao, arrived on the 27th at San Fernando de Atapabao. They lodged in the same house which they had occupied at a mouth previously when going up the Rio Negro. They directed their course toward the south by the Atabapo and the Temi. They were now returning from the west, having made a long circuit by the Casaquare and the upper Orinoco. Quitting San Fernando on the 27th, they arrived by the help of the rapid current of the Orinoco in 7 hours at the mouth of the Rio Mataveni. They passed the night in the open air under the granitic rock of the Alcacetillo, which rose in the middle of the river, the form of which reminded Humboldt of the ruin called Mouse Tower opposite Bingen. On the evening of the 31st, they landed just before sunset on the eastern bank of the Orinoco in order to visit the cavern of Ataripe, the sculpture of a destroyed nation. They climbed with difficulty, but not without some danger. A steep rock of granite entirely bare. It would have been almost impossible for them to have fixed their feet on the smooth and sloping surface, but for large crystals of feldspar resting in a decomposition which stood out from the rock and furnished points of support. Scarcely had they attained the summit of the mountain when they beheld the singular aspect of the surrounding country. The foamy bed of waters was filled with archipelago of islands covered with palm trees. Westward, on the banks of the Orinoco, the wide-stretching savannas of the Meta and the Casanare resembled the Sea of Verdun. The setting sun seemed like a globe of fire suspended over the plain, and the solitary peak of Unia, which appeared more lofty from being wrapped in vapors, which softened its outline, all contributed to deepen the majesty of the scene. Immediately below them lay a deep valley, enclosed on every side. Birds of prey and goatsuckers winged their lonely flight in this inaccessible place. The travelers found a pleasure in following with the eye their fleeting shadows as they glided slowly over the flanks of the rock. The most remote part of the valley was covered by a thick forest. In this shady and solitary spot on the declivity of a steep mountain, the cavern of Atarupe opened to the front. It was less of a cavern than a jutting rock in which the waters had scooped a vast hollow. When, in ancient revolutions of our planet, they attained that height. In the tomb of an extinct tribe, the travelers counted nearly 600 skeletons, well preserved and regularly placed. Every skeleton reposed in a sort of baskets made of the pentacles of the palm trees. These baskets had the form of a square bag. Their size was proportioned to the age of the dead. These were some of the infants cut at the moment of their birth. The travelers saw them from 10 inches to 4 inches long. 3 feet 4 inches long. The skeletons in which them being bent together. They were not all arranged near each other and were so entire that not a rib or a phalanx was waiting. Phalanx. The bones had been prepared in 3 different manners, either whitened in the air, and the sun, dyed red with anoto, or like mummies, varnished with odoriferous resins, and enveloped in leaves of the heliconia, or the plantain tree.